To keep our episodes focused on our experts and the value that they bring to these conversations, we're supplementing them with some deep dives. These additional episodes may consist of conversations between Tim and Alyssa that deserve to be heard in full, or may highlight even more insight from our expert guests.
In our first episode, we referenced the internal systems the LDS Church uses to manage and often contain allegations of misconduct, systems of reporting, documentation, and a private church court process. We're going to take a closer look at how that system actually works. In the case of Frank Curtis, he was officially disciplined, excommunicated, and even rebaptized, all through this internal disciplinary framework. Understanding the steps in that process gives us a critical insight into how the church handles serious accusations and matters of spiritual sin. To explore this further, we're going to look at how issues are reported within the church's missionary program. In LDS culture, young men are strongly expected to serve a 2-year full-time proselytizing mission, while young women have the option of serving for 18 months. Nowhere are the church's frameworks for reporting and recording more clear than on a mission, and the systems and mentalities formed during that time deeply shape church culture as a whole.
During World War II, they created an officer training school because they needed to fill the ranks of a 3-4 million person army, and they needed to do it immediately. And at this school, they couldn't effectively test and weed out those who needed to be weeded out. So they came up with this policy or this plan where they encouraged people to basically report their roommates and others, and it was resented. Did you feel like your missionary partner was supposed to report back on you, or that you were being monitored by the very person that you were bunkmates with?
Yes. I mean, definitely. Like, at least on my mission, there seemed to be an organizational measure where you would be separated from your companion and you would be asked to report on them in the context of a broader report about your mission in general. Even in the handbook, the rules, you're encouraged to report anything that's outside of the rules. And that is very common. It's just like at BYU, it's always very
stressful.
Yeah, like Big Brother.
Wow.
So on a Mormon mission, there is a tremendous amount of reporting. And as a woman, you're always reporting to a man. There's only one instance where you would report anything to a woman. So that already is kind of creating a strange experience. So you report to your district leader, you would report how many lessons you taught, how many, baptisms you have planned or commitments to be baptized, how many hours you spent tracting or walking around knocking on doors. So there's just, you're just sending a lot of data their way. And then you also report to the zone leaders. You also could report to the assistant to the president. You could also report to the president himself. So you're really in the mindset that you're kind of reporting everything that's happening to you. And you also write a letter to your mission president every week, kind of explaining, what you've been up to. And I had a sense that reporting was a way that I could get help, that seeking help from an ecclesiastical leader was kind of the way that you found assistance on your mission. And they recently changed the handbook, but it used to say, if there's an emergency, you'd think it would say, what? Call 911, because of like an emergency. But the old handbook said, if there's an emergency, call your mission president. And so there were many instances of missionaries having a gash and like having blood running down their side, and they won't call 911 because you're supposed to talk to the mission president first. So everything that happens to you feels like it has to get filtered through this reporting, this setup that you're kind of existing in as a missionary.
There's probably no other church on the planet that documents to everything to the extent that the Mormon Church does. But to your question, in the Jeremiah Scott case, we learned through the handbook of instructions that there's this internal church court system. It's a lot like a secular court. They have a judge who's the stake president or the bishop in a bishop's court context. The stake president has assistants who actually serve in a supposedly advisory capacity, and these are individuals who are, generally high priests, and they're drawn from various wards in the stake, and they're called to serve on a stake high council. There's a ward clerk that sort of serves like a clerk does in a real courtroom. also takes notes. And under the handbook, the accused has a right to have an advocate, which is another member of the church who serves in that capacity. The stake president can also appoint somebody to serve as a kind of prosecutor. So when you look at one of these things, when they actually happen in their full-blown self, looks very much like a criminal court. I can relate to this. So in a criminal case, in a secular court, there's a trial, or maybe the defendant pleads guilty. There's findings by the court supporting the plea of guilty. In a Mormon court, if the person doesn't contest the accusation, then it proceeds to sentencing, just like in a secular court. And then the judge or the stake president imposes a sentence, which can be anything from a relatively minor a slap on the hands to disfellowship to excommunication. But excommunication doesn't really mean excommunication. It just means kind of temporary excommunication. And the bishop believes that when a person's repented and says that they're not going to do it again, that God is speaking through their tongue and God wouldn't lie, and therefore the bishop is obligated to take it at its face value, and the person is recycled, my word, back into the good graces of the church. And all of this is completely unbeknownst to the members of the ward or stake, that this guy is a hideous multiple offender known to the church. Church didn't report it to the police, so there is no public record of it, no reporting of it. So nobody in the community knows. And yet you go to church on Sunday, and this person sitting right next to you is a person that you wouldn't let get within 1,000 miles of your kid, and yet they're sitting right there. And the only clue that a fellow member might have that something is a little wrong going on here is that they weren't permitted to take sacrament for some period of time. And they go, oh, what's that about? Well, that could be anything. Maybe they have a drinking problem, or maybe they're a wife beater.
So discreet, they might not even, nobody might even notice.
Might not even notice. So you really have to understand and get down into the weeds of this system to do what you ultimately have to be prepared to do as a lawyer, which is to take this case, any case, and put it before a jury. You have to be able to present the story of your client and this church to people who know very little or nothing about the LDS Church to understand how this is going to happen, because it's a story, it's a narrative. And particularly if you're seeking punitive damages, which are damages meant to punish the church for this behavior and to deter this kind of behavior on the part of the church, defendant, and other entities who may cover up and conceal child sexual abuse. This is complicated, and you have to know it like you really have to know it. And then you have to bring in witnesses who can testify, or you have to be able to cross-examine their witnesses about this so that you can lay out the whole story of the LDS Church.
You may remember from episode 1 that Tim talked about the forms he was allowed to see during his involvement in the Jeremiah Scott case. This is the form that's filled out as a result of the church's disciplinary proceedings Tim just explained.
But I got to see the form, so I know what it looks like. So that's an important part of their system. So when you ask me how extensive is the problem in Utah, the church knows. And I've got depositions where I've deposed the director of the risk management department. These are basically the insurance company within the church that handles claims of all kinds. And these are, insurance professionals, employees of the church, and they, are responsible for identifying and reducing risks to the church. What's the frequency of somebody slipping and hurting themselves on the carpet in a ward building? What's the frequency of missionaries, crashing a car and injuring people? What's the frequency of all kinds of things that can happen as a result of activities of any corporate organization? And they track all these things very, very carefully. But when it comes to child sexual abuse and the frequency of it, I asked, and I've asked multiple over time, directors about this. So you track all these other risk factors. Do you track the risk of child sexual abuse in the Mormon Church? No. So do you have any idea how many cases there are? No. Have you ever conducted a survey of membership? No. Have you ever tracked the number of claims that are brought and settled? No, that's handled by our law firm.
We're going to be talking more about the church's helpline in our next episode. But if you're thinking about whether or not to bring your own personal experience to church leaders, consider this last piece of advice that Tim has about the church's internal court system.
But the church has records of these excommunications, which they keep. So it's important that you come forward whether the person has been convicted in our criminal court system, because this person needs to have a record within the church court system. And when later victims come forward, that record of a prior excommunication based upon child sexual abuse is discoverable, can become evidence. And the church will fight to prevent us from getting access to that record, but we will get that record. It's the evidence of their knowledge, of their callousness, in their own words, in their own writing, that they've kept. And it's the best kind of evidence there is. So if you want to make kids safer and it's not possible to obtain a criminal conviction, you can still come forward and compel the church to document the abuse that you suffered at the hands of this individual, if only because there's now a permanent record that they cannot destroy, that they cannot eliminate. And eventually, in time, I believe a court will order the Mormon Church to open up all of these reports of church court action, just as the Catholic Church has been ordered in various dioceses around the country to turn over all of their priest pedophile files. And it will be a shocking day when people see the magnitude of what this church has been doing for decades.